Hi guys, welcome back. This is part 2 of the series for making summer clothes and summer clothes patterns. So I'm so glad you could join me. I cut out my pattern, or my fabric, from my pattern. And the first thing I'm going to do is put the right front and the right back panels together, right sides of the fabric together, and it looks something like this. I'll show you a better picture in a minute. And I am going to stitch that together beginning at the crotch seam and going down toward the hem at the bottom. Now the reason I want to sew from the crotch to the bottom is because sometimes with stretchy fabric, which this is, sometimes it'll stretch a little unevenly as far as this piece and this piece. So if that happens, it's not going to be as big of a problem because I'm going to stitch both of my seams, which is the inner seam and then also the outer seam. I'm going to start both of them at the top going down. So if there's any discrepancy in the fabric, it's going to be at the bottom, and most likely I can deal with it when I'm hemming it. I've stitched both legs together on both seams. All right, and this is what we have now. One other thing I forgot to mention is the stretch of the fabric. You want the stretch of the fabric to be going horizontal as opposed to vertical. And also any, if it's a lined pattern, you definitely want to make those lines going vertical as opposed to horizontal. And then the next thing we do is we just match up. This is the front middle seam. And I just take this one and we're going to match up both front and middle seams, right side to right side. And instead of starting at the waist seam, I need to start at the crotch seam for that same reason I mentioned a minute ago for the stretch. I want to make sure that if there's any discrepancy with the fabric stretching, I want it to be at the very end. So I'm going to start at the crotch seam and I'm going to sew the front, start at the crotch seam, and sew the back. Now I've sewn the center seam together, and I also went along and did a zigzag stitch to finish my raw edges and trimmed all the excess off. Now I'm going to turn these inside out and I'm going to start pinning the waist. Now remember, we allowed 2 inches at the top. So for this first step, I'm going to fold it over right at 1 inch and pin it there. And once I get that pinned all the way around, I'm going to run a zigzag stitch to hold that in place. I finished my zigzag stitch and cleaned up the extra off the edges. And I'm going to do the same thing again. I'm going to fold it over 1 inch. I have to make sure it's the full inch because this right here is my elastic and I got to make sure it's going to fit through there. See, and I have to keep in mind when I do my zigzag stitch, my zigzag cannot come up too high, otherwise my elastic won't poke through when it's time. Now I use a zigzag stitch because you want to use a stretch stitch on your machine when you're using stretchy fabric. Otherwise, the fabric stretches and the stitch is not designed to stretch, so your stitch breaks and then you have seams that fall apart. So always be sure if you're using stretchy fabric that you use a stretch stitch on your machine. Oh, and also, this is the back, okay? And with the elastic, the seam that's going to hold the elastic, we always want to start on this back seam, okay? And what we're going to do is we're not going to finish it all the way through. I'm going to start it right here, just to the right of the center seam, and I'm going to go all the way around, and then I'm going to stop short right here so that I can stick the elastic in, and then once I've got the elastic in, then I will stitch that little piece closed. I finished running my zigzag, my second zigzag, and as you could see, I don't know if you could see while I was sewing it, but I just kind of straddled right over the place where I had pinned. That way you get a nice clean edge. And I'm ready to put in my elastic. Now, the way that I measure my elastic, I just put it around where I want the pants to fit around my waist, and I want it to be stretching a little bit. Okay, you don't want the elastic just sitting there without any stretch in it. So pull the elastic around your waist to where, you know, it's stretching a little bit, and then cut off, I would say, about this much extra, because when we put it all in the pants, then we'll have to stitch that together. But that's how I measure my elastic. Nothing too scientific about it. So I just take a safety pin and I just stick it into the end of the elastic, and I go to my little opening that I left and I stick it in there. Once I've got it in there, I can just kind of shimmy the safety pin along and pull the elastic through. And when I get close to the end, I just make sure that my second end doesn't go all the way in before I can grab it. So I've got my elastic all the way through. Oops, it just popped back out. Okay. So I am going to pin it to the other end so I don't lose that. And then the next thing I need to do is go around and make sure that it hasn't gotten twisted, because I wouldn't want to sew it twisted, then it'll be permanently twisted. That would be not cool. So I just go around and check all the way around. And then where it meets up, and then make sure that's facing the right way, which actually it wasn't. Okay, so I'm going to turn this piece. Okay, I'm just going to put a pin in here to hold it, and I'm going to put a zigzag stitch to stitch the elastic together. I've stitched the elastic together. Now I just need to stitch this little bit closed that I left open. I hemmed the bottom just as we had planned with 2 inches, so you just, fold it over an inch, fold it over another inch, pin it, and hem it. Now, technically these pants are finished, but here is where we can decide if we want to get creative. And I decided I would like to put in a couple of decorative drawstrings. They're not going to do anything because the elastic is actually the waist, but I'm going to put in some decorative drawstrings with some beads at the end. So this fabric is it's very, very thin, and it tends to get caught in the machine. So I'm not going to try to do the normal way that I do little drawstrings. I'm going to make it easy on myself, and I'm just going to put in a couple of zigzag stitches here. I'm going to put 4 stitches, and then I'll cut the strips after I stitch it. So I'm not stitching on this tiny little piece of fabric, okay? And then I will put the beads on and attach it to the garment. So I put in my 4 little zigzag stitches, and now I'm just going to trim off the extra. All right, I've got my little drawstrings, and I'm gonna just see, I found some beads, and I'm just gonna see if these will go in here. I might need to use a pin or a needle or something. Okay. Making sure I attach them to the front instead of the back. That definitely sounds like something I would do. So let me make sure I've got my front. So here's one I already pinned. Okay, I put it about 2 inches from that center seam. Okay, so now I'll do the other one. Oops. So I go this way and then fold it over like that. And that's how I'll stitch it on. And I'll just do a straight stitch with that. All right, so these are finished. Let's try them on and see how they fit. So I dug in my summer stuff. I found a tank top and some sandals to really try them out well. And this is the finished product. So I'm going to make one adjustment to the pattern. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you next time.